check sat on the glass table between them, and Clara Doyle would not pick it up. $500,000. Charles Ashford had written it himself in his own hand, the way he had not written a personal check in 15 years. He slid it across the table with 2 fingers, the way a man pushes something he is certain of. And the woman across from him, a cleaner, in a coat worn thin at the elbows, with the smell of industrial soap still on her hands, looked at it the way you would look at something that had crawled in from the rain. "I don't want it," she said. 3 words. Quiet. Final. Charles Ashford owned the tallest building on the west side of the river. He had bought and sold companies before breakfast. In 30 years, no one, no banker, no rival, no enemy, had ever pushed his money back across the table. People took what he offered. That was simply how the world had always arranged itself around him. Rain ran down the floor to ceiling glass behind him, 41 floors above a city he had helped build. The check lay between them like a small white animal that had died. "You don't understand," he said. "This is yours. No conditions. You can walk out of here and never clean another floor as long as you live." "I understand exactly what it is," Clara said. And she folded her hands in her lap, the way she folded everything, slowly, deliberately, as though each motion had been earned. He would remember, later, that he had almost laughed. He had been so certain that money was a language every human being on earth could speak. He had no idea that the reason she was about to give him would follow him for the rest of his life. That it would unmake him, quietly, in a room with the rain coming down. That a man who had not wept since they lowered his wife into the ground would put his face in his hands in front of a cleaner and not be able to stop. To understand how Charles Ashford ended up crying across a table from a woman he had fired 3 weeks earlier, you have to go back. Back before the check. Back before he followed her car into a part of the city he had spent his whole life never seeing. You have to go back to the morning they called her a thief. Charles Ashford had built his world to keep grief out, and for 2 years it had almost worked. The Ashford Group occupied the top 11 floors of the building that bore its name, Ashford Construction and Development. The company his father had started with 1 truck and a borrowed ladder, and that Charles had grown into a skyline. Towers, hospitals, the new transit terminal across the river. If you stood on his floor and looked out, half the cranes you could see were his. He arrived every morning at 6:40. He left every night after 9. In between, he signed things and declined things. He was 61 years old, and he had become very good at being alone in a way that looked, from the outside, like strength. His wife, Eleanor, had died 2 springs before, a quiet cancer that took her in 11 weeks. She had been the one who remembered the names of people. The doorman's grandchildren, the night cook's bad knee. Charles had never needed to learn those things, because Eleanor had carried them for both of them, and when she died, he discovered he did not know how to see people at all. So he stopped trying. He let the company become a machine, and he let other people run the parts of it that needed a human face. The person he let run the most was Diana Crow. Diana was his director of operations, and she had made herself indispensable in the long fog after Eleanor's death. She managed the building, the staff, the contracts, the budgets he no longer had the heart to read line by line. She was efficient. She was always available. She brought him reports that always concluded the way he hoped. He trusted her the way a grieving man trusts the person who keeps the lights on when he cannot. He did not know, could not have known, because he had stopped looking, that Diana Crow had been the project manager on the Halford Street site 4 years earlier. He did not know that 3 men had died there, that the safety logs had been signed off as complete when the harness anchors had never once been inspected, that the families had been handed thin envelopes and made to sign papers, and that Diana had been promoted 6 weeks later for handling a difficult situation with discretion. He did not know any of it. That was the whole point of how he had built his life. He had made himself a man who did not have to know. So when Diana came to him one gray Tuesday morning and told him that one of the cleaning staff had been stealing systematically for months from the executive kitchen, he believed her. Of course he believed her. He had no reason on earth not to. "Who?" he said, not looking up. "The new one. Doyle. Clara Doyle." Diana set a folder in front of him. "I'm sorry, Charles. I know you don't like this kind of thing. I'll handle it quietly if you want." But Charles Ashford, that morning, did not want it handled quietly. Something in him, the grief turned hard. The part of him that had decided the world was full of people who only wanted, for once, to see it, to be there. "No," he said. "I'll come down myself." It was the first interested thing he had felt in months. He mistook it for justice. They did it in the executive kitchen, at the change of the afternoon shift, with an audience. That was Diana's instinct, and it was a cruel one. The kitchen staff were there, the cooks, the porters, 2 of the catering girls. Walter, the old building superintendent who had worked the property for 31 years, stood in the doorway with his cap in his hands. 3 members of the operations team. And Charles Ashford himself, who almost never came below the 35th floor, standing by the steel counters in a suit that cost more than most of them made in a season. Clara Doyle was brought in still wearing her gloves. She was a small woman, 53, with gray threaded through dark hair pinned back off her face. She had cleaned the executive floors for 7 months. She did not look frightened. She looked the way she always looked, composed, attentive, as if she were waiting to be told which room needed her. Diana held up a clear plastic bag. Inside were containers, the good kind, a catering kind, packed with food. Roast chicken, bread rolls, a wedge of cheese. Things from the executive kitchen, where the leftover catering from board lunches and client dinners was supposed to be logged and discarded. "This was in her locker," Diana said, loud enough for the room. "This morning. Like every morning." She turned to her audience, performing for people she was certain were on her side. "She's been doing it for months. The chef flagged the portions weeks ago. Security has her on camera at the walk-in after every shift, walking out the service door with bags. A whole life spent working for people," she added, with a small smile, "and this is what she does to the hand that feeds her." The cooks looked at their shoes. One of the catering girls had gone white. "This is theft," Diana went on, warming to it. "From your kitchen. From you. While you've had other things on your mind." And Charles, who had come down to feel something, felt it. A clean, cold anger. Here was a person who had taken advantage of his distraction. Here was proof that the world was exactly as small as he had decided it was. "Is it true?" he asked Clara. His voice was very quiet. "Did you take it?" The room held its breath. "Yes," Clara said. Just that. No excuse rushed in behind it. No flood of explanation. The single syllable landed in the kitchen like a dropped plate. Diana's mouth curved. "There, you heard her." "Then I have no choice," Charles said. He found to his faint surprise that he wanted her to argue, to beg, to give him something to push against. "You're dismissed. Effective now. Walter will see you collect your things, and security will see you out." Diana was already gesturing to the guards. "Get her bag. All of it. I want it searched in front of witnesses." They emptied Clara's locker onto the steel counter in front of everyone. A spare cardigan, a worn paperback, a photograph of a man in a hard hat, laughing, that no one looked at closely, a child's drawing, folded into quarters. Diana picked through it all with 2 fingers, holding each item up as though the smallness of Clara's life were itself a kind of guilt. Through all of it, Clara Doyle stood straight. She did not cry. She did not reach for her things. She watched a stranger turn out the contents of her life onto a cold counter, and her face did not break, and her back did not bend. In the doorway, old Walter gripped his cap so hard his knuckles went white, and said nothing, because he was afraid, and he would carry that silence for 3 weeks like a stone in his chest. When everything she owned was back in the bag, Clara picked it up. She looked at it for a moment, the small weight of it. Then she looked at Charles Ashford, directly, without heat. The way you look at someone you have decided to forgive in advance, because hating them would cost you more than you can spare. "You can search every locker in this building, Mr. Ashford," she said. Her voice was low and even, and the kitchen went so quiet you could hear the walk-in humming. "You can check every bag I have ever carried out of that service door, and you will find exactly what your camera found. I won't tell you it isn't food, because it is." She settled the bag on her shoulder. But the thing that's actually gone missing from a house like this, the thing nobody's noticed for years, your cameras were never going to find it, and neither was she. She did not even glance at Diana, because it was never in any of these rooms to begin with. For a moment, no one moved. The sentence had a strange completeness to it, like a door closing softly in another part of the house. Charles felt it land somewhere under his ribs and could not have said why. Then Diana laughed, a short, brittle sound, and broke the spell. "Spare us, Walter, the door." And that was all. Clara Doyle walked out through the service corridor she had cleaned for 7 months, past the loading dock, into the gray afternoon, and the steel door swung shut behind her, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. That is what grief does, when a man lets it harden instead of carry it. It does not make him cruel all at once. It makes him certain. And a certain man stops asking questions. And a man who stops asking questions can stand in his own kitchen and watch an innocent woman be destroyed and call it order. Charles told himself he felt nothing. He went back up to the 41st floor, but the line stayed with him. The thing that's actually gone missing from a house like this. He turned it over that evening and could not make it lie flat. He had expected a thief to sound like a thief. She had sounded like a woman who knew something he did not. He told himself, the next evening, that he only wanted to understand. That was the decision that saved him, though he did not know it yet. He could have called the police after all, or simply forgotten her, the way he forgot most people now. Instead, on the Wednesday, Charles Ashford did something he had not done in 40 years. He drove himself, alone, no driver, no schedule, and waited in the rain outside the service entrance at the end of the late shift to see where a fired cleaner could possibly be going with bags of food she no longer had any reason to take. Because that was the part that would not lie flat. She had been caught. She had been fired. And Walter had mentioned, almost too quietly, that she had been seen that very evening near the loading dock again, not stealing now. There was nothing to steal, just standing, as if waiting for someone to hand her something. So he waited. And at 10:15, a small, rust-spotted car coughed to life in the far corner of the lot, and Clara Doyle pulled out into the wet street, and Charles Ashford, in a car worth more than the building she was driving toward, followed her. He did not know the city he drove into. He had built half its skyline, and he did not know it at all. The good streets gave out faster than he expected. First the avenues he knew, the lit shop fronts, the valet stands, the doorman under awnings, and then a long stretch of ordinary blocks, laundromats and bus shelters, and the blue flicker of televisions in third-floor windows. And then something past even that, a part of the map his whole life had been arranged. so that he would never need to enter, where the street lights stood too far apart to do any real good, and half of them were dark anyway, where the pavement gave up without warning and became packed dirt slick with rain, where the houses leaned together like tired men holding each other up, and where his long, pale car moved through the dark like something that had taken a wrong turn out of another world entirely and could not find its way back. He kept 2 streets back. He did not need to follow closely. There was nowhere out here that a car like hers could be going in a hurry. She stopped at the end of a street with no name his GPS could find. The house at the end of it was barely a house at all, a low, sagging structure with a tin roof patched in 3 colors. One window lit a dim and buttery yellow, a porch that had given up being level years ago. The only new thing on the whole property was the lock on the door, a heavy, bright, brass deadbolt that must have cost more than everything else Clara Doyle owned, bought to protect whatever was inside from a world that had given her every reason to expect the worst of it. It was the kind of house a man like Charles Ashford had only ever seen from the window of a moving car on his way to somewhere else, the kind he had spent a career replacing with something taller and cleaner and worth more. And it struck him, sitting there, that he had built an entire life out of tearing down houses exactly like this one, and had never once wondered where the people inside them went. The rain drummed on his roof. A loose sheet of metal somewhere knocked in the wind, patient and tired, like a clock that had given up keeping time. And that bright new lock on the broken old door said everything the street itself was too proud to say aloud, that whatever was inside mattered more than everything outside it combined, and that someone had spent what little they had to keep it safe. Charles parked in the dark and turned off his engine and sat there, a rich man in a quiet car, not yet knowing he was about to lose the version of himself he had arrived as. He got out. He did not decide to. He simply found himself standing in the wet street. He crossed to the side of the house where the light was, his good shoes sinking into the mud, his coat, a coat that had been fitted for him by a man who came to the office, soaking through at the shoulders. There was a gap where a board had warped away from the window frame. A dog barked somewhere down the row, and a light flicked on across the street, and for one cold second he nearly turned and ran back to the car like a thief himself. Then, before he saw anything, he heard it, a child's voice, small and unguarded, and warm in a way that no child in that house had any right to sound. "She's home, she's home, she brought the bread." And then another, younger, and then a third, and then Clara's voice. But not the voice from the kitchen, not the low, even voice that had refused to break. This was a different woman entirely. This voice laughed. This voice said, "Wash your hands first. All of you, go on. And Lucy, help Sam with his chair. And no, sweetheart, there's enough. There's always enough. Sit down." Charles put his eye to the gap. There were 5 children at a table, made of 2 doors, laid across cinder blocks. The room was clean, scrubbed. He could see that even from here, scrubbed the way the executive floors were scrubbed, by someone who knew how. A single bulb, a mattress in the corner, made up neat as a soldier's, and Clara, still in her thin coat, unpacking from her bag the exact containers he had watched Diana hold up as evidence, the roast chicken, the bread, the wedge of cheese, and laying them out, not for herself, not for resale, not for any of the small criminal reasons a man like him could imagine, but onto 5 mismatched plates in front of 5 children, dividing a board lunch that would otherwise have gone into a steel bin on the 41st floor into the only hot meal these children would eat that day. He understood, standing in the mud, exactly what he had fired her for. He had fired her for feeding children with the food he threw away. He should have left then. A decent man would have left. But Charles Ashford stood frozen at the gap, because the children had gone quiet, and they were folding their hands. The oldest girl, Lucy, The others called her, perhaps 8, with her mother straight back, looked around the table to make sure everyone was ready. And then, in the high, clear, unembarrassed voice of a child who has said the same words every night of her remembered life, she said grace. "Thank you for the food," Lucy said. "Thank you for Mom, who brings it. Thank you for this house with a good lock." A small pause. "And please look after our dads in heaven. Sam's dad, and Emma's dad, and my dad. Look after them, even though the man who built the building never said sorry. Mom says he doesn't know. Mom says when people don't know, you don't hate them, you just pray they find out." "Amen," said the children. And the littlest one, Emma, added in a whisper that carried straight through the gap and into the rest of Charles Ashford's life. "Miss Clara's the only one who really loves us." Outside, in the dark, Charles Ashford made a sound he did not recognize as his own. The man who built the building. He knew, with a certainty that arrived before the details did, exactly which building. He knew, before he saw the photograph again in his mind, the man in the hard hat, laughing, folded into a paperback in a locker, that it was a face he had signed a condolence card for and never read. He knew that the food on those plates came from his kitchen, that the children at that table were the children of men who had died building the very towers he could see from his window, that the woman dividing the bread was the widow of one of them, and that he had stood in his own kitchen 3 weeks ago and called her a thief in front of a room full of people, and that she had said yes and stood straight and let him. He did not remember crossing back to the car. He remembered only that his legs would not hold him properly, that he had to put one hand flat against the cold brick of the house to keep from going down, and that the brick was wet and rough and real in a way that almost nothing in his life had been real for 2 years. He remembered sitting behind the wheel with the key in his hand and not being able to fit it into the ignition because his hands had begun to shake badly, the way a much older man's hands shake. And when he finally stopped trying, he put both arms on the wheel and his forehead on his arms and stayed like that for a long time. In the dark, in the rain, in the worst neighborhood he had ever been to, and the closest he had been to another human being since the day his wife died. He had built his whole life so that he would never have to know. Now, he knew. He did not sleep. By 6 the next morning he was at his desk, and for the first time in 2 years, he read. He read everything. He pulled the Halford Street file himself, and when the current safety records were missing pages, he called Frank Olson, the safety officer who had retired 4 years ago after a disagreement no one had ever explained to him. And Frank, who had kept his own copies in a box in his garage because something had told him to, drove them in himself before noon. Charles pulled the kitchen logs. He pulled the catering invoices. He pulled 4 years of operations budgets Diana Crow had been certain he would never read, because grieving men do not read budgets. It was all there, once a man decided to look. The harness anchors at Halford Street had never been inspected. The logs had been signed off as complete. The signature was Diana's. The families had been paid almost nothing, fast with papers to sign, and Daniel Doyle, ironworker 41, had been one of 3 men who never came home. His widow had taken a cleaning job 7 months ago in the very building his death had helped pay for, and no one in operations had flagged the name, because the person who hired the cleaning staff was the same person who had the most to lose if anyone ever connected the dots. And the food. The catering budget showed thousands of dollars of discarded surplus every month, surplus Diana logged as destroyed and quietly resold to a private caterer she co-owned through her sister's name. Clara Doyle, taking home what was genuinely thrown away, had been the perfect thing to point at. A small, real theft to hide a large, hidden one. He called the board for 11 o'clock, and he called it in the same room, the wide glass conference room off the executive kitchen, where Diana had performed her evidence 3 weeks before. He made sure the same people were there. The cooks, the catering girls. Walter, in his good cap. He even sent a car for Frank Olson. Diana came in expecting a meeting. She left as something else. He laid it out without raising his voice. The falsified logs, the resold food, the 4-year theft, the name she had hired and hoped he would never read. He let the document speak. Diana tried once. The old performance, Charles, you don't understand the pressures of. And he simply set Frank's copy of the safety log in front of her, with her signature on it, and she stopped. Security will see you collect your things, Charles said, and then they will see you out the service door. He paused. I believe you know where it is. Walter, by the wall, let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 3 weeks. He put his cap back on his head, and for the first time since the Tuesday he had failed to speak, the old man stood up straight. That afternoon, Charles Ashford drove himself back to the street with no name, and this time he knocked. He had brought the check, $500,000, written in his own hand, because money was the only language of restitution he knew how to speak fluently. He sat at the door and cinder-block table where the children ate, too big for the room, and he slid it across to her, and Clara Doyle would not pick it up. I don't want it, she said. You don't understand, he said and heard, with horror, how many times in his life he had said exactly that to people who understood far better than he did. This is yours. No conditions. I understand exactly what it is. She folded her hands. Your money already came to my door once, Mr. Ashford. It came in a thin envelope the week after they brought my husband home from your Halford Street site. And a man I never met made me sign a paper while I was still deciding what to tell my daughter. I took it then, because I had a child and no choice. She looked at him steadily, and her voice never rose. I won't take it a second time to make you feel better. The money was never the thing that was owed, and it was never going to be large enough to be the thing that was owed. And that was when Charles Ashford, 61 years old, who had not wept at his own wife's grave because he had decided that weeping was a thing that happened to other people, put his face in his hands at a table in a falling-down house and could not stop. He cried the way the children had prayed, plainly, without performance, for the men who did not come home, and for the man he had become, so that he would not have to think about them. Clara Doyle did not say, there, she let him. That was its own kind of mercy. I'm sorry, he managed. Finally, I was blind. When he could speak again, he did not offer her money. He offered her something specific. He did not ask her to take charity. He asked her to take command. The Ashford Group would establish a foundation, funded, endowed, real, with lawyers and a charter, and a name carved into stone in the lobby of the building her husband had died building. It would support the family of every worker the company had ever failed. It would inspect every anchor on every site, to a standard written into every contract from that day forward. And both the foundation and the standard would carry one name: the Daniel Doyle Foundation, the Doyle Standard. I named it after him, Charles said, because his name should have been on something other than a settlement paper a long time ago. He asked Clara Doyle to be its director, a real title, a real salary, a real office on the 41st floor, not because he pitied her, but because he had finally understood that she was the only person he had ever met who knew exactly what the company owed and exactly to whom. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said yes, not for herself, for the children, because yes would feed them next year, and the year after, and would feed children she would never meet. She would never have to fight alone again, and neither would they. They held the dedication in the lobby that spring. The families came. the children of Halford Street, Lucy and Sam and Emma in their best clothes, and 100 others. Walter stood at the front in his good cap. Frank Olson came. They unveiled the stone with Daniel's name on it, and then they did a simpler thing. They put long tables across the marble lobby, and they ate, all of them together, the powerful and the forgotten at the same tables, board members passing bread to ironworkers' widows. While the children chased each other across a floor Clara Doyle had once been fired for cleaning. And at the moment the room went quiet for the blessing. Every window in the lobby sealed against the spring, the great building utterly still. A sudden small warm draft moved through the room and made the candle flames on the tables all lean together as one, in the same direction, and then stand straight again. Walter felt it on the back of his neck and smiled and said nothing. But Lucy looked up at her mother and said very quietly, "Dad's here." And Clara, who knew better than to argue with what a child knows, only nodded. If you have ever carried something out of a building every night that no camera could ever record, if you have ever been called the worst of what you are by people who never once stopped to ask what you were carrying or why, then you already understand what Charles Ashford spent 61 years failing to learn, alone at the top of a tower full of people whose names he never knew. Because in the end, no one is ever truly remembered for the money they kept, or the floors they owned, or the height of the towers that carried their name into the sky. They are remembered only for the hands they fed when no one was watching, for the dignity they refused to set down, even when it was the last thing left to carry, and for the small, unwitnessed, world-changing courage of giving away the very thing they could least afford to lose.